All right. Welcome to the 2017 State of the Department Address, and this is a information-filled, jam-packed, compressed presentation. So I'm going to try to start on time, and I may go just a minute or two at the end. Hopefully, we'll stick to the time. But it's a special edition of the State of the Department Address. So first, I want to let people know next week we have a very special Grand Rounds. It's the annual resident graduation address, and this year's speaker is Kay Redfield Jameson, who is an incredible figure in the field of bipolar disorder and psychiatry in general. She herself has manic depressive illness, and she wrote with Fred Goodwin the standard book the standard textbook on bipolar disorder. She wrote about her own experiences in a landmark book called Unquiet Mind, and she's talked about the link between mental illness and creativity in a very lauded book called Touched by Fire. And she has a new book out on the poet Robert Lowell and the connection between his art and poetry. And I highly commend it to you. She's a wonderful writer, a wonderful person, and received many distinctions, including the MacArthur Genius Award. So I hope everybody who's here today who's interested will come next week for the graduation address. My disclosures are that I consult, in terms of financial interests, I consult to a number of pharmaceutical companies for less than $5,000. I have a patent related to ketamine that's been licensed by Janssen, and other patents that a few other patents have been licensed but aren't worth anything, and I have some options in companies. All right, so I want to set the tone for 2017, and I'm going to do it by showing you a video developed by Yale New Haven Hospital in collaboration with us in the department to tell you a little bit about the mission that we have at Yale New Haven Hospital, Psychiatry and Behavioral Health. And I think that there's a lot in this that you'll find interesting, and so I'm just going to go right to it, and we'll see where it takes us. This is a transformative time in terms of mental health in the United States. Over the past 30 to 40 years, we have developed sophisticated behavioral and medication treatments for psychiatry illnesses, but there still is a large group of patients who need a more specialized, a more definitive treatment for their mental illness. Here at Yale New Haven Hospital, we're really pushing to deliver those definitive treatments to help those patients who haven't responded to the usual routine treatments for mental illness.
I've been in treatment pretty consistently since I was in middle school. A combination of different styles of therapy as well as different medications, and my functioning was pretty high, but I tended to still really struggle with these feelings of just profound aloneness and despair, and
VPN is on hold. All right, let's try this.
About 3 years ago, I kind of slipped into what I would consider a very severe depression.
There's no need for an individual to accept struggling with symptoms of depression for years on end. We are striving to improve outcomes as best we can, to have folks achieve a level of functioning that they haven't achieved in years. And recently, with the growth of the Yale New Haven Hospital and Yale New Haven Health System, we've had much larger opportunity to really expand the services of Yale New Haven and bring the research from the Department of Psychiatry to the clinical care of folks that we're treating at Yale Psychiatric Hospital in ways that are exciting and transforming that care.
Some of the innovations that we've introduced at Yale New Haven Hospital include defining what we consider to be an emerging subspecialty within the field of psychiatry, which we call Interventional Psychiatry Service, or IPS.
What's unique about the service is we have three different kinds of interventions. The first is the classic ECT or electroconvulsive therapy. The second is transcranial magnetic stimulation, also called TMS. And what's particularly unique in this service is what we call KIT, or ketamine infusion therapy, which is really a state-of-the-art use of ketamine.
I'm receiving intravenous ketamine, and the day after I received my first treatment, I felt like myself. But what was strange, it was like immediate. The next day I woke up and I felt I could internalize good things about myself. I could feel positive feelings. I could feel feelings in general.
Ketamine was actually first developed at the Yale Department of Psychiatry approximately 20 years ago, and we've been studying it since then. 2.5 years ago, we became the first academic center to offer it as a clinical treatment.
To see these treatments actually administered in day-to-day routine clinical care is extremely rewarding for us. This is what we work for, this is what we hope for, and this is what we need as a field to make a difference in the lives of patients.
IPS has a robust teaching component, so one of the pleasures of my academic life now is I get to come to work and teach the future leaders in psychiatry, not just nationally, but internationally.
We're developing a generation of experts in this area who consider themselves to be interventional psychiatrists.
My residency experience was phenomenal. I worked really closely with the Interventional Psychiatry Service. It's a really exciting place to work because you're not just working with other residents or with attendings, you're working with the clinical researchers who are on the top of their game. You're working with mentorship opportunities that help you figure out sort of where you want to go in your career.
There is a lot of energy at Yale New Haven Hospital now, and at the School of Medicine. There are a lot of people very passionate about what we do, and there's folks bringing the passion that they have in research and understanding the basic neurobiological mechanisms of illness and bringing that to the clinic, to the inpatient units. And there is a sense of teamwork here in how we are doing that. That is what really is the secret to how we're moving ahead.
I'm constantly overwhelmed by the gratitude I have for this treatment. And so thankful I live in an area where there's such innovation happening and resources really being dedicated to giving people who are suffering, not just lessening their suffering, but helping them get back to their lives and live full lives that are enjoyable and valuable. And I didn't even know this was possible.
All right. So that's some of the stuff that we're doing. I want to acknowledge the contributions to that video by a particular person in our audience today. Ashley, if you wouldn't mind standing up, a person who shared her story with us, if we could give her a round of applause. It's a critical reminder that if we want to make a difference in psychiatry, it's not just something that we're going to do as professionals, but it's going to take a lot of courage on the part of people to have the wherewithal to get up and speak out about what it's like to have mental illness and the promise that treatment brings, in order that other people who aren't seeking treatment and who suffer in silence can pursue getting the help that they need. So Ashley, thanks so much for doing that on behalf of everybody here today. I also want to acknowledge the partnership, particularly with our Senior Vice President Michael Holmes and Mark Sevilla, that have really transformed Yale New Haven psychiatry. It's a very exciting time at Yale New Haven for us, and I feel blessed to have such wonderful partners in the work that we're doing. So what I'm going to be talking about today is you may have noticed it's been a heck of a year. I'm going to talk about how we need to focus on our mission and what that really means, how we're going to focus on our community by focusing on our people and what that might mean, and then, as usual, to talk about honors, transitions, and a little bit about training. So, you know, my mother would say, "What a punim." When President Trump was elected, it had some expected and some unexpectedly profound effects on our day-to-day lives. One is that we noticed an increase in hate speech. The election seemed to empower people to engage in hate speech and to focus on divisive elements in our community. Very early on in his presidency, President Trump threatened the lifeblood of the integrity of our department, which is we're very diverse, not only within our national community, but international. And President Trump threatened the visa status of our trainees and some of our faculty members. Then we had the amazing American repeal of Obamacare passing in the House of the American Health Care Act that has profound implications. And then President Trump now, for the second time, has threatened the national research infrastructure with proposed cuts. So I want to talk about each of these because each of these ripples through our community. The first is responding to hate speech. And we try to respond to that through awareness, empowerment, and support. We called attention to the problem through a series of emails throughout the department to all members of the department. We had special meetings with our trainees, actually, that helped to amplify our understanding about what the nature of the problem was. We then established within institution discussions, in other words, a discussion at the VA, CMHC, Yale, New Haven Hospital, and we shared a variety of educational materials so that people could be better informed about how to recognize, but equally important, to be prepared for how to intervene when it happens around them. We had a special workshop on dealing with hate speech, which was led by Kirsten Wilkins, and I thank her for doing that on relatively short notice. And then we had a grand rounds on hate speech in which we had a professor from Fordham Law School, Kamani Paul Emile. And this isn't the end of our interventions, but this is how we kicked off our attention and our response to this, which I think is extremely important. Everybody has a place here, and for that to be the case, we have to support everybody and not allow our colleagues, our patients, or ourselves to be victimized. A second ongoing issue is the issue of how we support diversity in the department. And I want to acknowledge Ismini Petrakis for her leadership of the task force, and now joining in her work, our assistant chair for diversity, Cindy Crusto. And just to point out that the committee has been very active and continues to be very active. It's now a standing committee of the department. We've made sure that we have members of underrepresented minorities on every departmental committee. We've diversified who in the department gets to meet with our lecturers so that people from various, all hopefully aspects of the department get opportunities. We've augmented the scope of the diversity chair. We're collecting data. We're actually in the process of analyzing data about our culture of inclusion. We now have diversity grand round speakers and topics. We have a chief resident who's focused on diversity issues in the department, a diversity chief resident. We've diversified the art in the departmental offices, and including our conference room, where we're still working on it, where the art, you might say, was too male, too pale, and too frail. That's a quote from Tom Innes. But basically, people said that they came to our department conference room and basically saw paintings of senior white men and felt like that was not so inviting. So we're working on that. And we're working on workshops on implicit bias and microaggressions. And again, this isn't the end of the list. This just is part of our ongoing effort to strengthen our community. We're better as a community if everybody has a place and if we recognize the problems that make people feel disenfranchised and work on them on an ongoing basis. As a community, we spoke out against the visa restrictions. There was an incredible rally. I saw many people from the department there speaking out against Trump's executive order on immigration, and essentially it's been overturned and they've tried to come back to it, but this remains an ongoing concern for us, in which we in the department, the medical school, the university are actively engaged. If you don't know about what the Republican American Health Care Act contains, you should, because the provisions, if passed, if they made it into the final bill, would be devastating. It would end Medicaid as an open-ended entitlement and replace it with capped grants to the states. OMB has projected over 20 million people would be disenfranchised. In other words, would lose insurance if that happened. It would allow states to opt out of the basic principles of health care as outlined in the Affordable Care Act, which include aspects of mental health parity, pre-existing conditions, and other aspects that were so important in prior parity legislation in the American Affordable Care Act. And it could undermine many other initiatives, such as the 21st Century Cures Act, the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, and others that are making a difference for mental illness, but also for addiction. In the context of the opiate epidemic, it seems unforgivable to undermine this initiative. Governor Malloy estimates that Trump Care would cost the state $1 billion a year. We're a state that's already struggling to find a way to balance our budget. And I just want to let you know and to acknowledge and thank that many people in our department are going to Washington, or in Connecticut, testifying or providing input to legislators. And I particularly want to acknowledge our SWAT team here, Kemka, Luming, and Jessica. We made the rounds in Washington, and it was both very eye-opening in some ways, as we heard, for example, Senator Burr's staffer say that it was actually a good thing to allow states not to provide, to ensure people the basics of health care. So, I think this is very eye-opening, but again, the answer is that we need to be informed and we need to be engaged in trying to make change. So another one of President Trump's flights of fancy has been to try to undermine the National Institutes of Health. He initially proposed in fiscal year 17 an 18% cut to the NIH budget. That was overturned by Congress, who added $2 billion to the NIH budget. And then this year, he's going to try to undermine it even further with a 21% cut. Why is a 20% cut to the NIH budget so unbelievably devastating? Well, in order to understand that, you need to understand that NIH thinks in 5-year blocks. And so that every year, 20% of the NIH budget comes up for grabs in order to fund the grants that we all submit. If you cut the NIH budget by 20%, you eliminate the entire discretionary budget. No new grants essentially could be funded. Now, NIH has mandates, congressional mandates, which essentially compel them. There are actually laws that compel them to fund certain kinds of new grants. So where are they going to get the money to fund those new grants? They're going to get those dollars from your grants, the grants that you've already gotten that are awarded, that are already have been cut, and already were written in ways that were short in budget, because you can't always put the real cost of a grant into the grant that you write. So this would have a devastating effect. Now, some people said, well, we're not going to cut the real budget of NIH grants. What we're going to do is we're going to cut the indirect costs so you can still get all the direct costs. That is a complete shell game, and you need to understand this. The indirect costs that you get don't support the medical school and departmental investment in your research. So if you get your indirect costs cut, what the medical school, university, and department are going to have to do is to charge you for the same services as part of your direct costs. In other words, a cut to the indirect costs on grants, in other words, the facilities support fees, is the same thing as a cut to your direct costs, because the universities can't afford to pick up the slack. So we can't afford a 20% cut, and we can't compromise around indirect costs if we want to protect the integrity of the research mission. Another little shell game, in a way, that the White House has been playing has been to undermine this structure, which is, I think, going back to Bush Sr., drug abuse was so important in the country that they created an office in the White House called the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and created a position that we call the Drug Czar, that watches over and integrates across all government entities dealing in addiction. Essentially, what President Trump is doing is eliminating the Office of National Drug Control Policy and creating a new position called the Mental Health Czar. Now, the Mental Health Czar is a deputy, an assistant to the head of Health and Human Services. And that's still a very powerful position in government, but it's no longer in the White House. And in government, proximity is everything. So they've essentially marginalized mental health and addiction at a time that President Trump is talking about how seriously he's taking the opiate epidemic. There's one bright light here. I think it's a bright light. I believe it's a bright light. And that's our own alumnus, Ellie McCants-Katz, is the person proposed by Trump to head this office. She's a smart person. She's a dedicated psychiatrist. And if she's approved, I believe we'll be very fortunate to have her in that position. A second person that where Trump has made the right decision has to do with another alumnus of our department. He's only an alumnus of our internship. He actually left, didn't do the residency with us, so he's not a psychiatrist. But David Shulkin was a very effective hospital administrator and is now the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. So those are two good appointments in this context. As you can tell, I'm not too happy with what President Trump has been doing. And I want to say something about how we need to express that unhappiness. And I want to thank Matt Goldenberg for his elegant article, commentary, in which he concludes, as a psychiatrist, I don't have a public opinion on Trump. As a citizen, I certainly do. And I think that is the stance that we need to take, because we have not evaluated him personally. We do not know how much of what we see in his public behavior is part of what he considers to be the theater of politics, as opposed to what he considers what he's like as a person. And he is surrounded by people who are observing his behavior up close and who can make much more informed decisions than we can about his psychiatric status. And so we have a guidelines around ethics. It's called the Goldwater Rule, which has been adopted both by the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association. And both professional organizations consider it unethical to make psychiatric diagnoses of people that you have not evaluated, for the very reason is that our diagnoses aren't even reliable when we see someone face to face. And so they're going to be even less reliable if we're diagnosing it based on what we read in the newspapers or in TV. Any of us who've ever been interviewed in a newspaper know that there are often times when what you say is distorted in some way. So, so speak out, but speak out as informed citizens, and be careful about violating the Goldwater rules. That brings us to Connecticut. And as you know, we are in a crisis, a financial crisis in Connecticut. We have a terrible deficit. And almost all the things that make Connecticut a special state, our attention to people with disabilities, our attention to people with mental illness, it's all on the chopping block. The Republicans even proposed privatizing the mental health system in the state of Connecticut. And they have, and the governor has proposed to cut the academic support for the academic mission at CMHC, to eliminate the remaining $947,000 in the budget, some of which he had already cut. What does that jeopardize? What does that jeopardize? We have here at CMHC what Thomas Edison called his invention factory. We have this academic mission which generates new treatments, new insights, new assessments, new ideas about the brain, about behavior. This institution, this research mission, has been under the gun year after year. And one of the reasons that we are still here today with one of the most exciting academic enterprises at the Connecticut Mental Health Center anywhere in the world is due to one person. I'm sorry, this mission is so important and our debt is so great. I'm very moved by our debt. I want to thank Representative Patricia Dillon, Pat Dillon, for being the guardian angel of CMHC. Every year that I've been chair, the governor has proposed eliminating the funding, the research funding at CMHC. And even before I was chair, that would happen. Every year, practically, or every other year, we would be fighting cuts. And there was one person who stood up every year, every time they tried to cut us down, and that was Pat Dillon. And so today I've invited Pat to CMHC so that we could present her with an Advocacy Award of Appreciation. Pat, if you would mind joining. Raise the lights.
I think you turned them down.
I turn them down?
Well,
Okay.
I'm hoping that you can get a better picture than that one. Although I had been up till midnight for 3 days in a row. So.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much. I had no idea I was going to come in and watch a video with Robert Ostroff's story. And I don't know if he's here, Robert, but Cindy Crusto lives around the corner from me. Anyway, I thought of it as a legislative mission, and I discovered it was something about friendship. And that tells me something. I mean, this is the future here. I can't be clearer. And you know this. We're learning about the brain. We're just learning. And when I was a new legislator 30 years ago, I met people at Fairfield Hills who had been admitted and spent their lifetimes there because they had a grand mal seizure. I also met people at Manchester Training School and at Southbury who had been admitted to a building that was supposedly had a totally different mission. They too had had grand mal seizures. Those decisions were made in the 1940s, and I was meeting these people in the 1990s. That is how far we have come and what we learn. And I'd love to say it's me. I chair the subcommittee, but We are under pressure, and we have so many friends, but I can't tell you strongly enough. People don't know what we do here in New Haven, and they don't know your story. And a lot of this is relationships. Good Lord, when Pfizer wanted to come here, Al Solnit called me and asked me to come over and meet. That's how we did it. Relationships, you should know this. Get to know your legislator this weekend, really soon, because they think they're giving money to Yale. If they start cutting any more at CMHC, we don't have any psychiatrists running our state system, probably. We can't recruit people. And if they want Pfizer to leave New Haven, okay, fine. I mean, they are under tremendous pressure. They're not bad people. They're doing the job they signed up for, but they need to hear the story. Everybody needs to hear the story. I'd love to know I was the champion. I'd love to know Donald Trump was the only problem. He isn't. He's the big fish, yes. And he did something last night that was very upsetting on the Dreamers' parents. And so I'm not too good today. But the reality is, he responded to crowds. He was fed by that. And we have to respect that. If he goes tomorrow, that's still there. And Mick Mulvaney, God help me, an Irishman, God help Jack, a Tar Heel, who created that budget, never sat on the budget committee. He's an ideologue. And every one of them down there is in the same process we are, and that is trying to accept that we have a budget problem, and they don't. They have money. They want to give it to rich people. Not that there's anything wrong with rich people. I hope there's some good ones out there. We are competing. We have all good things that want our resources. And if they don't know what you're doing here, it's gonna get hurt more. We need to tell our story. Get to know your friendly local state legislators. Both parties have people who are not helpful, and both parties have people who are helpful. Find them. Tell them your story. Face to face. Letters won't work. I could tell you, 2,000 to me on one gun bill this year. We can't keep up with that. We're just state legislators. Thank you for everything that you do. The progress that we have made in one generation should never be put at risk. Thank you.
I told you this was going to be a special day. Okay, so we have to focus on our mission. And our mission is to solve the problem of mental illness. It's that simple. We're going to solve the problem of mental illness. We have to figure out how to alleviate the distress and disability that these problems cause. And we do that, our one mission, we do that by delivering care. In other words, trying to translate what we learn into our practice, and by being compassionate and dedicated clinicians and scholars. We do that by training experts, leaders in the field, and we do that by developing critical teams, partnerships, in a way, partnerships between the patients also, their families, different kinds of professionals coming together, trying to solve the problems. And we try to provide, as a department, an infrastructure to support those efforts. Despite that, the signs are that we're not doing our job. We're certainly not doing it on a national level. Depression is the #1 cause of illness and disability in our country. Not AIDS, not heart disease, not cancer. It's depression. And while we're making progress in the mortality of diabetes and heart disease and all-cause mortality, the suicide rate is going up. The suicide rate is going up. Now, this Critical National Task Force, the USPSTF, says that everybody with depression needs to be screened. But we know that that's not what is going on in the real world. In the real world, in many respects, the model is broken. Too few people get screened. Only about 1/3 of the people who have depression ever get screened for depression. Among the people who are currently getting treatment for depression, mostly they identified themselves and sought help on their own. Only 1/3 of those people ever were screened for depression. Let's contrast that to, say, cancer, where for colorectal cancer, for breast cancer, for cervical cancer, it's 1/3 of the people who don't get screened. So 1/3 of the people do get screened for mental illness, 1/3 of the people don't get screened for most other medical conditions. And then when you get screened for mental health treatment, only about 1/3 of the people who screen positive and are referred end up getting the treatment that they need. Then we have a problem in our field, which is that our partnerships with patients are so great, our commitments to them so strong, that we feel obliged to deliver the kinds of treatments that we routinely deliver, even when they don't work. That we think, I think mistakenly, if we just try harder, we'll get there. And so we don't recognize enough when our given treatment isn't working, and we don't ensure that we refer those patients to definitive treatments. Nowadays, it would be a variety of things: evidence-based psychotherapy, intensive outpatient programs, rehabilitation-oriented programs. If you have psychosis, only about 10% of patients get clozapine, even though we know that clozapine is the most effective antipsychotic that we have. Even though ECT is the gold standard treatment for depression, the number of sites around the country delivering ECT is dropping, even though the rate and disability associated with depression is rising. So it's a time when I think even we in the field are frustrated and thinking out of the box. This year, we had the Rebellious Psychiatry, where mental health meets social justice, because we recognize that we're not meeting the public need in the way that we need to. My prescription, which admittedly is aspirational, and I'm not rolling out a plan for next week, is to think big. Because I think that what we do will be defined by what we aspire to do. We will become what we aspire to become. And so I think we have to work towards universal psychiatric screening and medical evaluation, universal access to treatment for psychiatric disorders, as we have near universal access to treatment for heart disease, diabetes, cancer. Earlier and more systematic referral to effective interventions when standard treatments are not working, including early detection and prevention, comprehensive treatments and rehabilitation, a move towards more personalized treatments and more effective treatments. And I think that we need to change the culture of psychiatry. In cancer, if you get cancer, they'll give you the first standard validated treatment for your illness. And if that doesn't work, they have something that's like that, maybe a little more toxic, that they saved. But if you fail those, you don't continue to get the same new treatments over and over and over. Most people, by that point in their cancer treatment, are now part of a research study. Because in cancer, they recognize that accepting inadequate or partial response is not an acceptable solution for the treatment of cancer. And I would argue that with rising mortality for suicide, rising disability from depression, that we shouldn't accept a different standard. There are many challenges, and I'd like to think with you a little bit about those challenges. One is that the primary care infrastructure, who we would count on to take this on, is overburdened and ambivalent about taking on obligations to treat depression when they don't know how to do it themselves or have the time. Another resource challenge is inadequate infrastructure in mental health. If we don't even have enough services to support the 1/3 of people who get treatment. If 2/3 more people started to get treatment for mental illness, it would overwhelm our resources. We need to think differently and do things differently if we want to meet this need. Inadequate reimbursements by third-party payers and government institutions, particularly Medicaid, which is reimbursing, say, hospital psychiatry for about 30 cents on the dollar now. Inadequate reimbursements discourage infrastructure development, and inadequate, I would say, NIH investment in treatment and research in mental illness is an obstacle to developing more effective treatments. A second challenge is expectations, and this is what I mean by thinking about what our aspirations are. That we have been complicit in the problems that I outlined earlier. And if our attitudes have to change first before the rest of medicine will change along with it, that we need to make sure that there is equal accountability for mental health screening and referral and at least referral to treatment, access to treatment for mental illness as there are for other things, which would include some standards which are gradually percolating out through the country. Public reporting of screening rates of depression, in other words, how many people have been screened, and referrals and treatments. And that there should be consequences for healthcare systems that don't screen and treat mental illness. A third challenge is workforce. Although you couldn't tell it from this room, there are not enough psychiatrists out there. The AANC has estimated that 2,800 more psychiatrists were needed in 2013, and the shortage in psychiatrists grows every year. The number of psychiatrists per 10,000 in the population drops every year. There are not enough psychologists. The number of psychologists in the country really hasn't changed between 2008 2013. And if we're only treating 1/3 of the people who need treatment, and we need to expand by address the 66%, in other words, triple the number of people who are treated, we can't expand the number of psychiatrists and psychologists enough to meet that need. We're going to need different models of care. Some of this may be broader partnerships with our primary care colleagues, better utilization or engagement of social workers, PAs, APRNs, and other specialties in delivering mental health treatment, and clearly better uses of technology. Technologies for screening, technologies for treatments, technologies to look at adherence and a variety of other things. Primary care has to be a partner. And actually, in one of the strengths of some of our public sector systems, like the VA, is that they've been working and building those partnerships for a very long time. Primary has to be the first line, and we have to figure out how to help our primary colleagues be more effective. There are workforce issues, time issues, reimbursement issues, but there are things that we can do. We can embed mental health clinicians in the context of primary medical care. We can engage patients with telepsychiatry, and we can do teleconsultation. We can develop and implement screening technologies so that while people are waiting in the waiting room, they can fill out questionnaires that greatly reduce the time needed for assessment and providing important detail. We can develop decision support tools for primary care, such as being developed by Spring Technologies, which help to predict and optimize antidepressant drug selection. And we can deliver the first line of behavioral health treatments through web-based technologies where people would have universal access. And these are just some of the options that can transform the way in which mental health care detection and treatment can live in the context of primary care. One example developed within our department is Kathy Carroll's and colleagues' program CBT for CBT, which is computer-based training for cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction. It's one example. Cobalt company spun off of the department, now part of Magellan, is another example. What about the earlier referral for definitive interventions? One of the things that we've recognized, in part from reanalyzing data, is that over time, about a quarter of the patients treated with antidepressants, and this is I'm going to extrapolate from the actual data, are worse off on the antidepressants they're getting than they would have been had they been on placebo. And yet, if you had looked at the data carefully, what you would have seen is that the people who were ineffectively being treated on the antidepressants improved. They just didn't improve as much as the people treated on placebo. And this is part of a struggle that we have in psychiatry, which is that when we have very limited aspirations for the improvement of our patients, then we confuse essentially non-response for a positive partial response. And sometimes it's useful to have actual data guiding our assessments so that we can actually see whether our patients are responders or non-responders, to help guide our decision making and to help push us to more definitive treatments. Another thing that we don't do enough is use the strengths of our community, draw on the strengths of our community to get second opinions and outside consultations. The standard, if you get cancer treatment, is to get a second opinion. It's very common practice in surgery, if they want to do, reattach something or move it to someplace else, to get a second opinion before they do that. We don't do that in psychiatry. It's not part of our culture. Our culture is about building the relationship, and the power of that relationship is wonderful, and we harness that every day. But it has a tendency to wall off treatment and isolate practitioners from their communities. And that professional isolation contributes, I think, to this problem of not using outside consultation or engagement of definitive interventions. One of the things that I find as I think about this problem is that engaging this kind of change, embracing this kinds of change, is going to make people feel uncomfortable. It's going to make practitioners feel uncomfortable because it impinges on how people do their everyday work. And we have to figure out ways, for example, if we really have integration of medicine and psychiatry, and if primary care is the gateway to mental health treatment, then we can't introduce artificial barriers between the documentation that we do for mental health and the documentation that you do for primary care. That we have to embrace primary care as part of the mental health team, and they need to see what we're doing, and we need to see what they're doing. It suggests that over time that there will be a greater intrusion of objective outcome and quality measures into psychiatry practice. And one of the challenges there is, how do we develop the right tools? How do we introduce those measures into clinical practice in a way that doesn't overburden clinicians who already feel overburdened by the documentation problems that we face? That we as a field need to take responsibility not only for the effort, but for the outcome. I love, there's a cartoon of a little boy who comes home from a soccer game with a 3-foot-high trophy and says, "We lost." We're losing. We're losing. We're like those soccer players. As a country, we're losing the battle in terms of treating depression. And we as a field need to figure out and take ownership for and change our practices in ways that meet the need. This is going to demand of us a higher level of collaboration and more thoughtful collaboration within systems of care and across entities like private practice and hospitals and hospital-based programs, departments, etc. And greater integration of research and clinical practice. I'd like to see the development of community networks where effectiveness-oriented research in the real world gets to inform the future practice of psychiatry. So in summary, this is a challenging time in many ways, but it's also a time when we can step up and make a tremendous difference. Some of it through advocacy and taking responsibility for what are obvious ways in which there is not parity. And secondly, we can be agents of change in terms of the world that we live in with regards to clinical practice and research. Third, about how do we focus on our community? I think it's easy for us, given how hard the work is that we do, to feel beaten down, isolated, disenfranchised, discouraged, undervalued. And that is a challenge that we face every day. Because if people walk around with that as their predominant feeling, they're not going to have the energy, the wherewithal, the community spirit to make the changes, and work for the changes that I just laid out. The starting point for some of these issues begins with salary, and I would like to spend the remaining time talking about everything that we do in the department related to how we're trying to make our salaries competitive nationally, how we're trying to move towards transparency and equity in the ways that salaries are counted on. And you'll have to take my word on it that I will come back another time to the department and talk about that. Again, another way we focus on our people is supporting the diversity of our community through recruitment and thinking about it in relation to promotion and in the leadership of our department. Our department leadership is basically half men and half women. The leadership of our institutions are both men and women. And we've tried to increase other aspects of diversity in the department. And we have a lot of structures in the department to try to enhance engagement and enfranchisement. We have the diversity committee that I mentioned before. We have set up the mentorship committee so that young people entering the department get at least every year a meeting if they want it, if they don't turn it down, meetings with people who will provide them input about the complicated academic culture of promotion. We have swim, and many members of the department engaged in enhancing the presence of women in our medical community, and more as well. Cindy Crusto, a very important member of the Moore community at Yale. And we have several members on the Dean's Council, Jason Johannesson, Chris Bittinger, Alison Ponce, and Paula Zimbrian. Peter Morgan just stepped down from that, and we are actually trying to figure out how to replace him. So let me say one thing about salaries and quality of life. So this is money on this axis, how much money you have, and this is helps you identify which specialty it is. So these are more salary is to the right, less salary is to the left, and the proportion of seniors, graduating seniors, is on the y-axis. Okay, so where do you think psychiatry is? I could make this a game. Do we think psychiatry is up here? No, psychiatry is down here. And to be fair, the average psychiatry salary that it looks like here with such a low engagement is about $250,000. And I suspect that there are a few people in the room for whom are not quite making $250,000 and realizing that they're over here and wondering, that's not so good. So this is an issue for our department, particularly when there's a shortage of psychiatrists. And it's particularly tough because it turns out that people are getting burned out. And one of the things that are getting burned out is that they're spending so much time on paperwork that the average doctor spends over 50% of their time filling out paperwork and only 29% of their time actually with patients. Even though when you ask what is the job, that would suggest that the job of a doctor is to fill out paperwork, and then on the side they do something with patients, right? As opposed to having the job of treating patients and then on the side filling out the paperwork. This is a tremendous problem for us as a field in terms of burnout. I would say that one thing that we have to be thankful for is that in contrast to many specialties, we really like our work. It's engaging, it's challenging, it's stimulating, in its own way rewarding. And so while there are two specialties way to the right from us, dermatology and ophthalmology, that have higher overall satisfaction, psychiatry is right up at the top of satisfaction of specialties. And that's something to keep in mind, that there's more than just the salary here, and that we are, but it is the start. A second dilemma for the research community is how beaten down people feel in terms of writing grants. I mean, it's tough. I mean, a lot of us are writing grants, if not for each of the 3 grant cycles each year. So at least 1 or 2 cycles a year. And that's time that could be spent doing research, writing papers, communicating the findings, mentoring our trainees. It's a huge burden and it's stressful. The good news is that overall our department is one of the most successful grant-getting departments of any psychiatry department in the country, maybe the most. We're arguably the #1 grant-funded department of psychiatry in the country. And it's encouraging that as tough as times are, and although we have a little bit of a downtick here, I think as you can see, that basically we've managed to continue to grow the grant portfolio. But the medical school, and this is I want to thank Dean Alpern for responding to the feedback from all the department chairs to try to develop a program for the younger investigators in the first 10 years on the faculty, to provide a little bit of support. And so the dean has come forward with a plan in the first 10 years to provide some part of the salary up to this NIH salary cap. And I'm not going to have time to go into it in detail, but if you're basically a full-time investigator supporting your entire salary on grants, or almost entire salary on grants, then for the first 10 years of your career, you will be eligible for up to 25% guaranteed salary support from the medical school and the department. Where's that money going to come from? Some of it's going to come from clinical revenues on the medical school side, and a little bit more than half is going to come from our own department clinical revenues. And it will also come from the dowries that people get. So there's no completely free lunch. Research contracts, foundation grants, and things like that. It has a little interesting, the plan has a little bit of an interesting twist to it, which is that if let's say you generate 90% of your salary on grants, so that you only need 10% support, and you don't need 15%, that you have money left over on your grants for 15%. That money the money that is defrayed by your 15% will go back to you. 70% of that will go back to you to help develop your program, and 30% of that will go back to the department. So not only is this a program that provides some security that we've never had before in the department, but it also provides really successful investigators with a way to augment the vitality of their research programs. Okay, honors. I actually don't have time to review what a good department we are this year. Take my word for it, we're really good. We're ranked high, the hospital's high, we have a high impact, our trainees are great, our faculty and staff are great, and the community spirit is great. We have a great department. It's an incredible department, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. This was a big year for us this year, the 50th anniversary of CMHC, and Mike Cerniak, I guess, was going to do his own expansion to CMHC, brought out the original shovel that dug the ground, which will be, I'm sure, a good project. No, it was a wonderful celebration, and it's a landmark, 50 years. It's been around for 50 years. This year we honored Kitty Dukakis with our Spring Advocacy Award, and Governor, it was a pleasure to meet Kitty and Governor Dukakis. This year we honored Herb Kleber at the American Psychiatric Association for his foundational and transformative leadership of substance abuse research and treatment at Yale. I started to go through the department's remarkable achievements. I started with George Agajanian, who received the Arvid Carlson Award from the International College of Neuropsychopharmacology. And then I started to get overwhelmed. And if you want to know what I mean by overwhelmed, let me just show you succinctly a bunch of the other awards. All of these people got a national award or distinction and brought credit to themselves and to the department over the years. I just don't have time to talk about everybody independent, but you see what an amazing place this is. There are incredible things. I don't know if you guys got an award for your basketball team, but I was impressed. I was very impressed by how tough you guys look. This is an amazing department. Everybody should be proud of being part of this community. The person sitting, you or the person sitting next to you did something that brought national distinction and made a big difference this year. It's just incredible. Transitions are a part of our life in our department. Lou Trevisan is now the VA Regional Mental Health Lead in DEMIS. Charles DK is now the Medical Director of DEMIS. Tobias is taking a leadership role at Whiting Forensic Institute. Frank Fortunati was officially, you don't get sworn in. There's swearing, but it's not about coming in. Is now officially the medical director. Peter Morgan is now the chief of psychiatry at Lawrence Memorial Hospital. As is always the case, we had a number of departures this year, actually several of them from Yale New Haven Hospital, Gila Kayum, Hyun Jun Kim, and a retirement of Bob Milstein. And Bob's retirement is very special to me because Bob and I started out running, I joined the faculty, and Bob and I ran the 8 East, what was then the 8 East, and then it was the 8 West unit at the VA. And he's been a core part of the department, received many teaching awards, really beloved member of our faculty, and he'll stay around, but will be retired from his main role. We also have some interesting other transitions, involving the departure of 2 beloved faculty members. The first is that Ben Lee, transformative leader of our psychological medicine service at Yale New Haven Hospital and psychosomatic medicine throughout the department, has been tapped to follow John Romano and George Engel, the pioneers of psychosomatic medicine at the University of Rochester, to become the next chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Rochester. He was recruited by a member of our department, who I will thank for doing that, Jeff Linus, who's the Associate Dean at the University of Rochester. So that's one unexpected consequences of the success of our alumni. Another important loss, but transition for our department, is Rich Schottenfeld. So also with Rich, someone that I've known since I came to the medical school in 1980. And Rich is just an incredible person, a leader, head of Davenport College at Yale, global thinker about addiction treatment and research, medical director of the App Foundation. I could go on. And Rich is leaving to take on an extraordinary challenge, but a challenge where he could have an incredible impact. He's going to be the chair of psychiatry at Howard University in Washington, D.C., a university that attends predominantly a focus on the underrepresented minority community and training the next generation, predominantly African American physicians. It's a really important job, and I'm very proud that he's stepping up to take that on. I did want to mention that we have a new dean in our alumni ranks. Giulio Licinio is the dean at SUNY Syracuse. He doesn't look very happy about it in that picture. This is also a sad year for us. We lost Howard Blue. We lost Stan Levy. Stan, I think, has been in the department since the 1940s or so, 50s. He, a pioneer in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, was one of the first people to write and speak out that homosexuality was not an illness, and just a really generative person in the department, very humble man. Howard Blue was the future plan, was our vision for the future of university health services. I met Howard when I was an intern, and he has been a remarkable, kind, generous, smart, capable, accomplished psychiatrist who died far too young, and who we'll miss terribly. So, as we always do, let's just take a moment to have silence to remember these two people. Okay. It's the great circle of life, though, isn't it? Because one of the things of which we are most proud of are the trainees, our psychology interns, our psychiatry residents, our postdoctoral fellows, our graduate students. And the incredible quality of them energizes everybody in our community, reminds us every day about why we do what we try to do. And we, particularly the senior faculty, learn as much from our trainees as they learn for us. We are blessed at Yale to have an incredible psychiatry residency program by any criteria, by the rankings, by how competitive it is to be selected to be in the residency, by how innovative the residency program is, and by the impact that it has on our community. I just want to thank the leaders of our training programs, psychiatry and psychology, for what they do, how much they give to building these exceptional programs. I particularly want to thank the residents, because one of the things over and over again, when I look at the reviews and letters and various data that they make available to us, is that when people come to Yale for the residency, they like the faculty. We're good, we're good. But the residents are great, and the residents, they say, convey to them what an incredible community they are in, and that makes a huge difference. I also want to thank the people, the faculty members, who every day are donating their time, volunteering without pay to be on the clinical faculty, and who have such a transformative effect on the lives of our trainees and through them, their patients. We couldn't be the kind of department we are without our voluntary faculty. And I also want to thank our voluntary the faculty, both voluntary and ladder faculty, who participate in the interview process for the residency programs, and I'm sure for the psychology interns as well. It takes a lot of time. It disrupts your day. There's no reward other than the pleasure of meeting these wonderful young people. So thank you for doing that. So, in summary, you could well feel like you are living in the midst of an astounding story, that the events of this world seem so extreme and unreal that you could think that this is someone's imagination, that apparently people on Jupiter are octopi with human bodies. But it may feel like that, it may feel like that it's that unreal. But I think we can get through this. And I think we can get through this because we can work together, and because we can become engaged, and because we can anticipate the changes to the extent possible that will come down the pike, and be ahead of change, making change as opposed to having change made upon us. And we do that by just a couple of basic things. We focus on the mission, and we focus on the people in our community. And rather than fight the change, we make the change. They say that the way to predict the future is to create it. And that's what we do. So with that, thank you very much for listening today.